panel will be held in English, and it is the panel that asks us the question, which has been for centuries a very meaningful question for all of us, how we are getting rid of colonial perception. And we are here to speak about Crimea, but also about much more than Crimea, about the very ways imperial imagination continues to shape how we see people and how we see places. We can speak about this context, about Crimea, and when we do that, we often encounter the very similar tropes about a romantic peninsula where Russian tsars and poets spend their summers, a pearl of the empire, which is suspended by nostalgia. And what we are missing in that image are the voices of those who suffered from the same empire, the Crimean Tatars. But we also know that this pattern is not unique to Ukraine, and that across the world, entire regions have been constantly seen only through the gaze of the empire. So today I will ask our dear guests, how can we dismantle these inherited ways of seeing the world and seeing ourselves, and how can we decolonize not only institutions, but also our imagination? And I'm very honored to welcome our guests. Some of them you already know. Ana Vázquez Colmenares, feminist author and human rights consultant from Mexico. Leila Seitbek, human rights activist and lawyer working in Central Asia, Kyrgyzstan, whom you already heard, both of them speaking in the previous panel, so I also hope to create some connection from the things we heard previously. Martin Alexander Kisly, executive director of Ruta Association, and online, we have Klunifa Mokoena, associate professor at the Weiser Institute in South Africa. So to begin, I'd like to ask each of you to reflect briefly on the question that will allow us to start the discussion. What does decolonizing perception mean in your own personal context? And I want to ask this question to Klunipa first, and to check whether she's online with us. All right, so then I would, oh yes, hello. It's nice to see you. Can you hear us well?
Can you hear me?
Right now, we are starting to hear you, yes.
Okay.
Great. Great.
There you go. I can hear the echo of my voice.
But we can hear you fine, and thank you for joining us. So I will briefly repeat the question so you could start our conversation. What does decolonizing perception mean in your context?
Yeah, I think from a global perspective, decolonization means we have to rethink the map of the world. So all the divisions that we've learned to use in the past, east, west, north, south, in themselves are based on the idea of colonization. So the idea is somehow there's something special about a place called the West, and the West is allowed to colonize the rest. I mean, this has been the general theme of the world for the last 200 to 300 years. And so decolonizing perceptions means that we have to rethink the very map of the world. So for some of you who may have not heard of this controversy, I'm going to summarize it for you. So for example, the map of the African continent, when you see it on paper and when you see it reproduced, it gives the impression that the African continent is a very small continent, that other continents are bigger than the African continent, when in reality, the African continent is essentially the biggest continent on the planet. And you may not think that this affects people's perceptions, but it does, because for some strange reason, people seem to talk about the world And in many conversations, they simply exclude the African continent as if it doesn't exist. So when people talk about the future of the globe, they talk about, let's say, China. They'll say, oh, China is now the factory of the world. China will overtake the West. China will be producing hybrid cars in the next 20 years or whatever. So all the world's projections about where the future of the planet is going are based entirely on the idea that Africa almost doesn't exist. But this is true of many other parts of the world. And I think this is true of the way that Ukraine has been treated. It's you bypass the fact that there are millions of people who identify themselves as Ukrainians, or you bypass the fact that it's a separate ethnicity or culture, and you simply subsume it under another category. So decolonization involves us breaking down these historical understandings of what the globe means, what does it mean to be a citizen of the globe, and where the power lies on the planet. Because again, when we talk about the West and the rest, it reinforces the idea that the West is powerful, the West is technologically advanced, all the great ideas come from the West, all the great books come from the West. So even the way that we read books, the way that we read literature is based almost entirely on the understanding that the best ideas come from the West. So even when people walk into a bookshop, they look for books that are bestsellers on, like, the New York Times bestseller. They don't think about what could be a bestseller somewhere else in the world. So decolonization means reorienting ourselves, really, and reorienting the map of the world and trying to change the way that we speak about what is important on the globe, who is important on the globe, who is going to be driving future trends on the globe, etc., etc.
Thank you very much for such a beautiful entrance to our conversation. I would give the word to Anna to continue.
Thank you. These past days in Ukraine have transformed somewhat my answer. Decolonizing the perception of the world means first naming the structures that want to erase you. And Ukrainians have told me that this invasion by the Russian Federation is not only about land or resources. It is an attempt to destroy the Ukrainian nation, to rewrite its history, to absorb its identity, to deny its very existence as a political subject. So I understood this deeply when we were visiting St. Sophia and St. Michael's Monastery in Kiev and hearing how Russian forces wanted to destroy them. These are not just buildings, they are memory. An empire knows something very clearly. If memory survives, domination fails. A few days ago, I met a Crimea leader, a Tatar representative. When he described what he described, we feel very painfully familiar to anyone from Mexico in the global south, actually. For instance, that Tatar language reduced to 1 hour a week in classes, in classrooms, textbooks rewritten to erase their presence, persecution of leaders, destruction of cultural institutions, demographics engineering to make them strangers on their own land. So this is not cultural policy, it is linguicide and epistemicide, and it echoes what happened and still happens to many indigenous peoples in Mexico and across the Americas. In Mexico, indigenous children were punished for speaking their languages. Spanish was framed as civilization, while indigenous identity was framed as something to be erased or folklorized. Anthropologist Guillermo Bonfil Batalla called this creation of indios desindianizados, un-Indianized Indians. People pressured to abandon their identity so the nation could pretend to be racially homogeneous. And I think, well, that's very much what decolonization of the perception of the world means. Thank you.
Thank you. Martin, could you please follow with your perspective?
Thank you. After my colleagues already contributed and elaborated on it, because it's definitely a mindset, a way of thinking, and as you already said, it is dismantling. And I would rather say even it's a kind of practice which contains of both sections, like undone and redone, because we are starting with understanding and critical approach, which was given to us by the post-colonial theory. And then we are coming closer to the action of redoing what was settled in other structures, the colonial structure, imperial structure. It may deal with different issues and different aspects of understanding or perception of assumption. In the case of a history, Crimean history or Ukrainian history, the historical narrative and the way it was written and how deep it's rooted into colonial practices and colonial structures is definitely the things that should be rethinked on the very first place. For me personally, if we are talking about decolonization as an action, not decoloniality as some kind of a phenomena, but decolonization as an action and as a process, probably it should contain some vital things that are highly needed for decolonization to be a successful strategy, like giving a voice to voiceless, the return of agency, sharing of stories, empathy, understanding, mutual understanding, solidarity and equality, definitely. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dear Leila, would you mind to join the conversation?
Sure. So I wanted to, before I get into the opinion on what decolonization is for the Central Asian region, I want to mention, maybe to those who know or heard less about Central Asian region, that is a region that has been colonized by first the Russian Empire and then by Soviet Union, and has been under its control for ever since, and even now. That grip of Russia on that region is still not weakening, and so the process of decolonization, I think, in our societies has started. It's quite not as strong as we want it to be, but this process already began, and it actually means. To people the ability to express themselves in very, for now in very small ways, because the situation in Central Asia is such that people are surviving under authoritarian rule. We do not have democratic countries in Central Asia, unfortunately. And in our experiences of colonization by Russia, a lot of things, as I have mentioned in the previous panel, is very similar to what Ukraine has experienced and what Crimean Tatars have experienced. First of all, of course, decolonization is a process that includes, first of all, the right to use the language. And in terms of Kyrgyzstan, that is what has exactly happened to us after Russia has taken control over our territories. They have denied us the right to use our own language. I, as Kyrgyz, actually grew up speaking Russian. And unfortunately, I do speak Russian even now much better than I speak Kyrgyz. I started learning my own native language only as an adult, and only after the collapse of USSR, which is quite sad because to us as nomads, language carries such an utmost importance, because as nomads, we did not build temples, we did not build palaces. Our temples and our palaces was our language, and that was taken away from us for centuries. We were not able to use it. During the colonization, we were separated from our historical memory by several changes of alphabet, which increased the distance between us and our ancestors' knowledge. The distance was just impossible to reverse. We cannot go back and read their whatever they left for us to read. unfortunately. And we were not allowed to be Kyrgyz. We were not allowed to practice our traditions in a free way. We were not allowed to speak Kyrgyz in public places, obviously. And if Kyrgyz was ever spoken, it was spoken very quietly somewhere in the kitchens. So that is something that needs to be clawed back. That is a process of decolonization for us, of course. And that is that should also lead to some sort of independence in policy making of the governments in our region. However, it's still too early to talk about them being able to make their own decisions without looking at Kremlin and seeking validation for their actions. That is something that our political elite is still unable to do. I will come back to more things, but maybe we can move on to another question.
Sure. Before we actually dive into each of speakers' contexts, I wanted also to invite to speak Tender, who is joining us from Tibet, and despite his health, he could join us, so I would gladly pass the word to him for him to also answer the same question. Is he with us? All right, so maybe he will join a little bit later. Today he was apologizing for feeling not well. So in case he joins, we might also hear the context of Tibet. So I would pass the word to Anna. So we could talk a little bit more about Latin American context. Since the Latin America, and specifically Mexico, lives with this double legacy of colonialism, it is connected to Spanish colonialism, but it also has this dependence, if I may say so, from United States. So how do feminists and human rights movements in Mexico work with these layers of colonial experience?
Yes, thank you. Well, as you said, Latin America has like these two layers of colonial power, very distinctive. Spanish colonialism. We were a colony of Spain for 300 years. And the geopolitical dependency towards the United States, in particular Mexico, shares almost 3,000 kilometers of border with the United States. So that's a huge impact on us. Both feminist and human rights movements in Mexico have confronted both types of colonialism. We resisted a Spanish legacy when we fought structural racism, when we defend First Peoples and protect indigenous languages. As I said, 68 official languages are spoken in Mexico, and well, there have been efforts to have them properly function. So there are dictionaries, there are books written in those languages, there is poetry written in those languages, etc. And as we resist US influence, when we oppose militarization, extractivism, and policies that threat Latin America region and treat Latin America as a subordinate region. In all this, as Leila said, language plays a central role. Spanish is a colonial language, yet it has become a tool for resistance through concepts such as cuerpos territorios, body territories, structural violence, and feminist memory. At the same time, we carry the pain of linguistic loss. More than 48 languages have been lost in Mexico. I do not speak Mixteco, as I said, because my grandparents abandoned it out of shame. The same colonial shame I recognize when Crimean Tatars tell us their language is reduced or forbidden. So language is the front line of colonial domination and one of decolonial liberation. And you mentioned feminism and how we linked from the previous panel. I think absolutely feminism has to do with decolonizing the memory. Is one of the most powerful frameworks to do this task. It asks a fundamental question: whose voices have been excluded from the history we are taught? In Mexico, the colonial patriarchal order produced fractured memories. It celebrated the conquerors, all men, the presidents, all men, the generals, all men, and erased indigenous women, Afro-descendants, domestic workers, migrants, and victims of femicide. A feminist lens expands then the archive of the nation. It recognizes the knowledge carried by mothers, by weavers, by community leaders, by cooks, by healers. The people empire teaches not to see. So my experience in Ukraine made this even clearer, as I mentioned. I think they work together.
Thank you very much. I guess taken from here, I would give the word to dear Hulunifa, and so we talk about South Africa a bit. So post-apartheid South Africa has been engaged in a dialogue about the decolonization of education and knowledge, and it's been decades, but the Eurocentric framework, it's still remains. And so what lessons from these debates could be useful for all of us, for Ukrainians, but also everybody who are taking part in this panel? And also whether language and feminist gaze is something that could be relative to you.
Thank you so much for that question. When it comes to South Africa, I like to point out that actually the project of decolonization in South Africa started as soon as many Africans had access to the printing press. And that was already in the 1800s. So many Africans who worked and trained as printers started printing newspapers and printing books in indigenous languages in South Africa back in the 1850s and 1860s. So some of the earliest newspapers in South Africa are actually in indigenous languages. So in our case, we cannot say that decolonization is something that started with the end of apartheid, because that project has been going on for a while. So in part, the biggest burden is for us to assume some of the positionalities that many of those early African writers took. So for example, not just caring about our own languages, but caring about all other indigenous languages. So many of these newspapers used to publish in multiple indigenous languages. So on the same page, you would have 3-4 different languages being published. And it was, I mean, literally it was the most, the earliest way of thinking about how to decolonize, where you stop thinking that there are no readers in an indigenous language. And I will say fast forward to about 2002 or so, after many years of people debating whether or not there was readership in indigenous languages, another newspaper was born in my own language, in isiZulu, and that newspaper has become one of the most popular newspapers in South Africa. So one of the things that I would say is that it is not just the new technologies that make decolonization possible. Some of the oldest technologies, like the printing press and the newspapers, and the newspaper actually make decolonization possible, because you print, the printing of a newspaper is essentially one of the most simplest ways of encouraging people to think and write and speak in an indigenous language. And I think a lot of decolonization projects often focus on formal education. So what happens inside the classroom? And one of the ways in which even the colonial mindset works is that you then create a contestation over the school curriculum. And in many ways, that for me as a historian, as a thinker, as a feminist, is often not a very useful way of fighting or resisting colonialism, that you pick the same terrain that the colonizer has already picked. So the education system is often the most contested space of decolonization. But it is not the only space that as decolonial philosophers and thinkers we can pick. There are so many aspects of decolonization: music, culture, museums, artifacts, the relearning of indigenous craft. So quite a lot of the times our grandparents would often try to teach us how to make things the way that our ancestors made things. Everything from making the most basic floor, a covering, a mat, a bedspread, a piece, a necklace, a piece of beadwork, etc., etc. So, for example, when I met some of your Ukrainian colleagues here in South Africa, I kept on telling them that I'd like to take pictures of the beadwork because I wanted to send it to my mother, because my mother loves beadwork and is very interested in different styles of beadwork from around the world. And these are some of the ways in which you take the decolonization project out of the most volatile conversation, which is a conversation about the school curriculum. And I know many decolonial philosophers like to debate school curricula, but actually, in many ways, that is almost, if I can put it this way, it's a lost cause, because the very people that you're trying to decolonize are often the people who propagate these ideas about a cultural superiority, etc., within the school curriculum. So in the case of South Africa, for example, English is often held up as an international language. Just that sentence alone, English is an international language, creates all sorts of inferiority complexes in which a person who speaks an indigenous language suddenly thinks that they are not international just because their language is not described as an international language. Or even the word language itself carries a lot of colonial baggage, because then you have questions like, well, what's the difference between a language and a dialect? So in the case of South Africa, you have many languages that are actually interrelated. They are like family, but because of colonialism, they've been divided and been told, you speak isiZulu, you speak isiXhosa, you speak Sesotho, you speak. Many of these languages are mutually intelligible. And so creating spaces where people are able to use those languages without having to think about whether or not they are speaking a standard language, an international language, an indigenous language, a threatened language. All of these terms in themselves, I think, carry anxieties, like colonial anxieties about how do you preserve languages. And as I say, the most quote unquote primitive technology, radio, television, newspapers, broadcasting. In South Africa, people often use WhatsApp to write in indigenous languages. So they write, when they write to their own families, they use WhatsApp, even though at school they are being told that they have to speak English as an international language. So one of the things that I would say, as what I've experienced in my own work, is that most people don't even realize just how much material has been created in indigenous languages by people who were living 100 years ago, who were already envisioning the decolonization of South Africa. And often much of that material is sitting in libraries and archives and simply needs somebody to go and open it and reanimate it. So my first point that I'd like to make is, I think one of the ways in which South Africa can contribute is to show that the school classroom is often, or the school curriculum or university curriculum is often not the best place to actually have debates about decolonization, because it is often an older generation of people who reinforce colonial ideas by telling children, grandchildren, nephews, nieces that no, you need to learn English because English is an international language. Don't bother with your own language. And it is those people who often need to be decolonized. And I know it sounds very strange because most of us want that joy of having a school curriculum that reflects us. But it is often an older generation of people who reinforce colonial ideas, and they are the ones who often need to be decolonized. And they are the ones who, in some ways, become the voice of the colonizer, even though they are indigenous, even though they belong to the same language group as you. So that's the first contribution that I'd like to make, and I'll pause there.
Thank you very much. A lot of curious thoughts. I would like to invite Martin to think or reflect on, and specifically, yes, this last point of how Anna mentioned, like internal colonization that you, Klonifa, pointed about. I think it's something that we could discuss in the Crimean context as well. So my question would be, is it possible for to think about decolonization of Crimea and Tatars like without rethinking what we know about them in Ukraine, what we think and how do like post-colonial history of Crimea, how is it supposed to be treated in Ukraine? Are there some principles that we create inside the country, and maybe that are supposed to be rethought?
Thank you for the question. And in the way you ask it, there is already a problem of what exactly is decolonization of Crimean history, because there is obviously a kind of dilemma we are facing, not only in Ukraine, not only in the case with Crimean history, but in a broader context. We can easily agree that the oppressor or colonizer is responsible for colonization and oppression, but who should be responsible for the decolonization process? Who should deal with consequences of colonization in the context of the so-called modernity? What are the actions we are waiting from those who were previously decolonized, who were previously colonized, and how they should act in this context? The same goes with the Crimean Tatars. If I stand on the ground that Ukraine and Ukrainian academia, Ukrainian scholars are responsible for the way Ukrainian historical narrative is mentioning Crimean Tatars, and what image was created for a long period of time, and to some extent is still present in this historical discourse of talking about Crimea and writing about Crimea. Surely it's deeply inherited into the colonial structure we were talking previously. But at the same time, who is going to rewrite this narrative? Who is going to pave the way for the way how it will be rethinked? Because we can agree on some basic principles according to which it will be done, like, as I said previously, agency of those who were colonized, and attention to their voices, which in history means just sources, to embedding sources which are coming from the community or the nation who were previously colonized, and many other principles that can be mentioned here. But we need an intention which is coming from below, because decolonization, as previously, is rather a mindset than a theory, a methodological theory that can be used as an approach in writing history or doing any other kind of research. So this decolonial mindset, I believe, should be grassrooted and horizontal, but at the same time, in some picture-perfect context, the right situation should be created for this intention to arise, to appear. And for the last 3 years, we are talking about that in Ukraine, this moment is happening now. There are more and more attention be paid to the problem of how we used to write history previously, even our own history. And the same goes with Crimea as a part of Ukraine, how we used to write Crimean history. To some extent, academia is slow and inert, and it's okay, because academia as an institution supposed to be slow and inert. We can easily name a dozens of brilliant people from academia who are proactive and who can reflect easily on many issues on every occasion, but academia is usually inert. But in the case with Ukrainian academia, this period of inertia is too long, because it started with the collapse of the Soviet Union, and I'm not sure we can point find a point in time when it's actually finished, when it's actually ended, because 2022 wasn't the end of this post-colonial period of critique and understanding of our colonial past. What can make this situation better, I personally believe, is just a mutual understanding which will help the whole situation be reshaped, as I said previously, undone and redone. Because we can talk a lot about decolonization of Crimean history and Crimean Tatar history, but I'm not sure that Ukrainians should rewrite it even from the most decolonial ground, according to most decolonial principle. It should be rewritten by Crimean Tatars according to our way of dealing with epistemic violence and other colonial structures which are deeply embedded into the history too. Thank you.
Thank you. I will use this chance to again call and invite Mr. Tender to join us and go through, since we're just talking about Crimea, talk a little bit about the Orientalization and exotization. And this is a case that sometimes happens with Tibet as well, as the world media often depict Tibet through this prism of exotism and spirituality. And how do you work with that? And good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. So if you just also could expand a bit on your perception of decolonization, we would be grateful.
Sure. Thank you. I'm very sorry about my voice. I woke up with a terrible cold, so I'll do my best. But greetings to all of you who are there and involved in this noble project, very important conference. And I think, many of you will probably find it easy to understand some of the situation and problems that are relevant to the case of Tibet. And I think, when it comes to the subject of colonial perception, I think one of the major problems that we face comes from the distinction between empire and nation. These days, many people talk about nationalism and also the problems of nationalism. And it's very easy to forget nationalism solves many problems while also creating many problems. And sometimes I think people forget that imperialism also created a lot of problems. And to me, when I think of decolonization, I would rather prefer to see decolonization as an avenue rather than a window. And we have somehow come to this place where self-determination is kind of a forgotten concept. And the reason for that, of course, is, we live in a state-based world. So there is a status quo bias in favor of states. So I think one of the ways in which we can push back against the current structure is by advancing or pushing for complete fulfillment of the right to self-determination as a human right, rather than self-determination as something that belongs to a particular historical window between 1945 and 1970, because if that's how we determine the era of decolonization and self-determination, then that makes it very difficult for the big states and the big empires to dismiss the demands of the small groups and the small nations and the legitimate people's demands for self-determination and say, well, you missed the window. And I think in the case of Tibet, like in the case of many other countries that deserve people who deserve their own self-determination, people who deserve the right to self-determination, we fall outside that window. So I think for us, the big task and the big challenge is to revitalize the discussion of self-determination as a universal human right. That is a promise that is still incomplete, unfulfilled kind of promise for millions of people around the world. So along with that, even the way colonialism is understood or described in many forums these days, people talk about saltwater colonialism, settler colonialism. And I think we, instead of letting other people define it, instead of letting the capitals and the big states and the politicians define it, I think we should actually take it up as our project and define what colonialism is. Colonialism can come in many different shapes and forms. It doesn't always have to come from Europe. It can come from outside of Europe. There are non-European colonizers. So I think those are some of the challenges that I think about. And also the previous speaker mentioned something about language also. And I think it's a really critical subject for many of us because our languages are always getting displaced. They're always getting marginalized. And one of the ways in which the bigger languages try to displace the smaller languages or the minority languages is by talking about usefulness or commercial value of a particular language, right? The market value of a particular language. But I think that's a very much utilitarian way of looking at a language and saying, that views language as a tool. And I think for us, it's important to push back by reconceptualizing language not just as a tool. Language is not a tool. It's a foundation of humanity. It's a way of being. It shapes who we are. So it is not just the question of like which language is more useful for my kids to learn, which language pays off more in the future, right? It is like, which is the language that defines who I am or who we are, which is the language that shapes our humanity. And I think there is no harm in speaking 2 languages, 4 languages, 5 languages. We have those abilities, right? So those are some of the things that I feel are important. And regarding the exotification, it happens a lot with certain countries that are steeped in religious spirituality. And to the extent that it happens in Crimea, I think it happens a lot with the case of Tibet. And part of that is, owing to the Tibetan Buddhist culture kind of being isolated on the plateau. It comes out of that, and also the Western interaction with Tibet historically over the last 300 or 400 years. But I think it's important to push back against that, or at least add different dimensions to that relationship, because exotification can also be quite dangerous. The problem, one of the key problems with exotification of a particular issue, it may sometimes get you short-term attention. So some people might actually like it because, it brings a spotlight to our cause, or it could bring some short-term attention. But the long-term danger is that exotification will eventually dehumanize who you are. It dehumanizes your struggle. It depoliticizes also and minimizes your needs as a human community or a political group. And it does that by sometimes glorifying your capabilities or glorifying your spiritual capabilities. And that's always a very easy way to politically dehumanize you and say, well, those are the people who don't actually care that much about self-determination, or they don't care that much about political power. All they care about is spiritual liberation or spiritual freedom. And that way it can be a double-edged sword, even when people engage in some kind of self-exotification. So we don't want to be trapped by the rhetoric of exotification. And I think finally, I'll just say, on our part, I think it's important to keep pushing back and keep, rehumanizing our issues and repoliticizing the struggle. At the end of the day, I think repoliticizing the struggle is really important, because sometimes when the situation is difficult, when there is a lot of constraints, there is a tendency among oppressed groups to depoliticize our cause or struggle and say, well, our struggle is not political because we are just fighting for the right to speak our language. Sometimes we'll say our struggle is not political, so please don't attack us. We're just fighting for the right to practice our culture. But the important thing is, whether it's the language you're fighting for, or culture you're trying to preserve, or some other aspects of your traditional identity or traditional medicine or whatever it is, eventually, without fighting for political power and political unity and political preservation, all of those other rights will eventually disappear. You're surrendering all those other rights in the end. So that's why I think we should always try hard never to depoliticize our struggle and our cause. I will leave it here for now, but yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and thank you for joining us, and hope you will get well soon. I will take from this word utilitarian and give the word for Leila, because in Central Asia, the Soviet colonial legacy is for a long time is framed as modernization and is like this utilitarian, useful thing to have. So how do you see this perspective affecting people's sense of agency, and especially considering what you are mentioning during all those panels, that the authoritarian regime is still ongoing?
Yeah, thank you very much for this very interesting question. So it is true that the colonization of Central Asia has been presented to us, the indigenous nations, that it was a great gift to us, that Russian people have brought us factories and schools and libraries and so on. And it obviously failed to mention that in the territory which Russia claimed as its own, that there were other civilizations existing in that at that time, the civilizations and states that were demolished, and whose resources have been partitioned and basically consumed by Russian Empire and later Soviet Union for its own purposes. This narrative, however, of basically granting us this great gift of being modernized, and otherwise we would have been left backward and illiterate, stupid barbarians. This narrative has not changed to this day, in fact. And even now, I must also mention that even now, the Russian opposition in exile continues to carry this narrative with it, and also continues denying agency to the nations that still continue remaining under control of Russia. For example, Yulia Navalny has actually made a post on social media that caused a lot of stir, especially in decolonial circles, where she spoke very negatively about decolonial efforts of various activists, and she called us decolonizators or something like that. And the Russian politicians that have been rescued from Russia and finally got access to various platforms to speak. They also quite often use these platforms to say that the nations that are held captive within Russia, that they are unable they will be unable to function as separate sovereign states, and that the West must do everything possible to ensure that Russia is preserved in its current form, with the only difference of, that country being without Putin or somebody else to replace Putin. But otherwise, they obviously want to keep the same, shape and form and same structure of what Russia actually is currently, which obviously, and we all understand, from its nature, Russia is not a country that can be democratized. It wasn't invented in that way. Its very foundation, its very structure, the essence of its existence, and actually the reason of its existence is anti-democratic. It cannot function in any other way. The only way it can continue functioning is only if it maintains its current autocratic rule, be it with Putin or somebody else. It's not going to make any difference at all. But unfortunately, the good Russians that are traveling the world right now, they continue carrying forward the same narrative that was used during the Soviet times, the propaganda of this great giving with modernization and so on. So yeah, there.
Thank you. I think that it is really important to pay attention to these tools, like the helplessness that is imposed on states and the countries and the people. As the same tool is the same subtle tool is how colonial and imperial vision is imposed through things like that are less noticeable, like beauty, nostalgia, like how we learn to be compassionate to one people and not to be compassionate to other people. So this is all about aesthetics. It's all about how we see the world. So I guess I would like to have this last round of questions and of answers actually to this point of how do you think aesthetics, our imagination, can be decolonized? Can it be? And what can we do about that? I would invite Anna to start first.
Thank you. Well, I think the colonizing aesthetics begins with asking this: who did we learn what we recognize as beautiful, as important, and who benefits from that definition? Colonial witnesses, as has been said here by our colleague from South Africa, privileges whiteness, European features, European art, Western art, and calls everything else exotic, craft, or folklore, right? Yet, for instance, the women who create this masterpiece that I'm wearing often remain invisible. Her name is Arnolda Rodriguez, by the way, I want to say her name. They're usually underpaid, and these pieces only become news when they are part of a brand, of international brand, or a European designer that takes and copy whatever they find beautiful because it's exotic in the world. And that is called cultural appropriation. And it is a colonial manifestation. So the colonizing aesthetics is not rejecting beauty, but it's reclaiming it. Reclaiming authorship, reclaiming agency, reclaiming cultural memory, and reclaiming dignity. Here in Ukraine, I saw how empire also attacks symbols of beauty, like this, many things that you have suffered, especially in Crimea, but also in all of Ukraine. So to decolonize aesthetics is to protect the beauty that the powerful, the empires, the colonizers try to silence, and to honor the creators behind it, and to rename and to appropriate the original names. It's very important, I think, to see how we want to be called, how we want to be named, and not to stand that others name us.
Thank you very much. Dear Klunifa, would you mind adding maybe some perspective on that?
I think the first thing that I would like to say is that for me, there can be no politics without beauty. I mean, when we try and imagine who we want to be without the colonial burden, we can't just imagine ourselves sitting in a parliament or having power or being independent. We also have to imagine exactly what we're going to be wearing while we are parading our freedom. So some of you may remember that our dear esteemed former president Nelson Mandela, when he came out of prison, he was wearing a suit and a tie. And soon, when he became president, he changed that and he adopted a style of shirt that was not even African, it was from Indonesia, but he adopted it as a way of breaking away from this idea that a president has to wear a suit and a tie. And it was a beautiful way for him to acknowledge all the different peoples of the world who had fought on behalf of South Africa, fought for the end of apartheid. And it was also a way of saying you don't have to wear a tie and a suit in order to be taken seriously and to be decolonial. So I like that gesture. And as I say, there can be no politics without beauty, because what is it that we're fighting for? What is it that we are imagining? We are imagining exactly a different world in which people are no longer commercially dependent on the Western world to set the trends. And I often get asked to speak at schools about cultural appropriation. And the other side of cultural appropriation is a kind of chauvinistic nativism as well, where people then assume that just because you are reclaiming your culture, it means other people are not invited to your culture. And I often say to people, there's so much beauty in many of our cultures that there's enough to share with other people. So in South Africa, for example, I'll give a very basic example. We have a long history of people from the Southeast Asia coming to South Africa, quote unquote, people from the Indian subcontinent, whatever term you want to use. So on Heritage Day, many people often simply pick what they wear from their own ethnic group. And I say, but why don't you celebrate the other people who have also shaped South Africa, who are from other parts of the world? You can wear a sari on Heritage Day because it is part of our heritage. So for me, it's as I say, that there is something political about beauty, and we need to include it into our conversations in order to get away exactly from this idea that it is only Western clothing and Western culture that is fashionable, that is professional. It's only Western hairstyles. So in South Africa, that is often a big debate about hairstyles and the way you do your hair, that only Western hairstyles, straight hair, that is fashionable or is professional. So all of those issues are political, and we need to find the language in which to speak about a decolonized aesthetic, a decolonized cultural sphere in which people feel comfortable with showing up as themselves instead of trying to emulate someone else's culture because they think that that is the culture that is winning. Because there's also this perception that this is a competition and somebody has to be declared a winner. And I think that is also the colonial mindset, that we are competing with other cultures and somebody has to come out as a winner. We can all win in being beautiful. And as I say, I love thinking about South African heritage as involving also these other cultures that have influenced South Africa, so that we are not just having a discussion about what is quote unquote indigenous, but we are having also a conversation about how indigenous people have taken cultures from somewhere else and made them indigenous and naturalized them and created new forms of aesthetics and beauty, etc., etc. So there's a whole world of beautiful objects that we need to talk about when we talk about what it means to rethink of yourself as a decolonized subject. I'll pause there and allow the other panelists to contribute.
Thank you very much. Yeah, Martin, would you like to add something on this, on aesthetics or nostalgia, or the way we treat history as well in this perspective of aesthetics?
According to established public popular image, Crimea is a holiday destination. Yeah, it's a recreation place. It's a place of resort, and since the mid of the 19th century, when after the end of the so-called Crimean War, Crimean Peninsula became a popular holiday destination, first for the Russian elite, then for the Russian ordinary people who were visiting it, for its sea, for its beautiful landscape, for its healthy mountain air, and many other things that are coming together in complex. Surely it was seen through the lens of Orientalism, which was copied by Russians from the West. Surely Crimea and its indigenous people, they were exoticized in many possible ways. Crimean Tatars, indigenous people, Crimea, they were even sexualized in a very colonial way, and we can learn it not from the historical sources, but even from famous Russian writer Anton Chekhov, who was writing about Russian ladies coming to Crimea to hang out with Crimean Tatars, horse riders. Which is a very typical colonial plot about contacts between metropole and the population in the colony. It hadn't disappeared in the 20th century with the establishment of Soviet Union and the emancipation policy and indigenization policy and any other different kinds of policies that Soviet Union at least tried to establish at the very beginning of its existence. With the very end of this period of time, with the very end of 20s in the history of USSR, Crimea was serving the same very role it was played during the imperial period of time as a place of recreation, as a place, as a resort, and it was for the whole 20th century on the same very same role. And Ukraine as an independent state inherited it. Crimea was a place of a popular place for a holiday destination for Ukrainians for more than 2 decades. And now we are facing kind of a challenge because Crimea is occupied for more than 11 years, and we already have a generation of those Ukrainians who have never visited it, even as tourists, who have never visited its infamous places that, like Artek, that kids in our region used to visit before the Russian occupation. At the same time, this image of Crimea as a beautiful resort is too deeply rooted in our public and popular understanding, perception of this place. But Crimea is beautiful. It's really pleasant to visit it and, I don't know, swim in a warm sea and breathe the healthy mountain air. But should it be treated the same way according to decolonial thinking? Should it stay the popular resort after possible deoccupation and decolonization? And who is in charge of deciding what will happen with Crimea, what role it will play? And I had a discussion many times with different people from Crimea, with Crimean Tatars and other people, how the tourism can be ethical. There are different ways and successful practices we can copy from other communities, from other places around the world, like indigenous tourism. But is there a room for another option here? Maybe there are maybe a new way of understanding this landscape and this geography should be invented and implemented. I'm not sure I have an answer to this question. There's surely a problem of how we are dealing with this image, because there are different dimensions. We can deal with the image through, as we started, through the academia and the way we are writing or rewriting, and how we are putting all these pieces together into new narrative with a critical understanding of how the imperial past influenced it, why the southern coast of Crimean Peninsula is typically a touristic destination, while Crimean Tatars are living mostly in the northern part of Crimea, while at the very beginning of 20th century or before the deportation of 1944, the situation was absolutely different. The mostly Crimean Tatar population were living at the southern coast of Crimea. But as I said previously, there is no answer because, first of all, I'm not feeling myself on the right position to decide and to answer, just to give some symptomatics of the problem. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I feel like with each answer we are opening more and more possibilities to make this conversation endless, but unfortunately we need to conclude, so I will give you, Leila, the possibility to answer the question and maybe find a way to summarize this discussion.
Yeah, well, it's quite, to me, it's quite clear of how the Crimea story can be reimagined, and I actually have a very bright example of what I would center that story on. For example, on Crimean Tatar women and activists sitting right here with us at the in the audience. So that would be, a very important angle to. An important angle to focus on, and to tell the story of Crimea through their stories, and through provide the image of Crimea through their eyes. And I think that is the most important angle that we should all, going forward, be focusing on. And that is something that I was quite frustrated with, especially. Again, going back to the Russian opposition, I was really hoping that they show up and maybe they will join our decolonial discourses and we'll find some sort of a support in them. And unfortunately, that didn't happen. And I've been talking with the activists of minorities within Russia, these nations, and they are working on their side as well. So they are centering their stories on themselves, and they are providing the images of their nations, through their own eyes and in their own languages when possible. Unfortunately, many of these languages are also lost. So yes, I think that is the main thing to take away is for us to start focusing on the nations that are fighting for their freedom, the nations that unfortunately remain under control of Russian authorities and are in grave danger. So hopefully we see the liberation of these people in our lifetimes. I really hope for that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, in this we conclude this conversation. Thank you very much, everyone who contributed, for all your thoughts. And we have so many questions, but I don't know if we have time for those. Okay, so we do have time, please.
Okay, I will speak Ukrainian, so please use translator, okay?
So I'm a Crimean Tatar artist and activist, and what I'm concerned about is the question of my culture, of my people, of what was going on, is going on, and what will be going on. And when it comes to colonial legacy, until 1928, we used the Arabic alphabet. In 1939, the Soviet Union introduced the Cyrillic alphabet, not only in Crimea, but also in Kazakhstan, in Kyrgyzstan, in Uzbekistan, for Turkic people. They were forced to use Cyrillic alphabet. In 1991, when Ukraine became independent, Crimean Tatars wanted to go back to Latin alphabet. That would be a transition. We used both Cyrillic and Latin alphabet, and in 2014, after the Crimea was occupied, unofficially Russia bans Latin alphabet. And to give you an example, Armanchakh children's magazine, they cannot use Latin alphabet to publish their content, and that narrows down the reach of this magazine, because our diaspora is in Turkey, in Romania, in many other countries using Latin alphabet. They don't know Cyrillic letters, and we cannot share our content with them because they won't be able to read it. And I discussed that issue with the magazine manager, and she told me we are pressured not to use Latin even online. I have a list of questions, sorry, and ideas. When it comes to diaspora, since Crimea Khanate was annexed in 1873 by Russian Empire, many Crimean Tatars were forced to flee to Bujak. Now it's Romania, and throughout 240 years or more, they, while speaking within families, they preserved the language of Crimean Khanate of the 18th century. So they, throughout these years, they preserved this language. In 1950s, 1960s, the Soviet Union, they wanted to conduct cultural appropriation. They wanted to eradicate Crimean Tatars, and in the schools, they introduced Crimean Tatar language lessons, but it was actually Kazan language. And Kazan ethnicity and Tatars are different peoples. We have a small percentage of, how to put it, commonalities and common roots, but in terms of DNA, we are different. The common things is Turkic language. For example, Crimean Tatars is Kipchak group, and when this so-called Tatar language was introduced in schools and children started to learn it, the parents were happy that their children would be able to learn this language. But when children started to talk with them in a different language, parents realized that there is something different, and they took their children away from these classes. So now there are extracurricular activities, dances, culture. That's the only space. When it comes to Crimea, since 2014, because the occupation authorities, they don't allow people to express their own opinion, people started to fight through their culture. And it is going on at the grassroots level with their own costs. There are lots of private schools to learn language. So now when there is this discussion of the new generation not knowing the language, by the way, there is a boom in Crimea in terms of learning Crimean Tatar language. And even now, and I like it that very much, since 2014 in the mainland Ukraine, in Kyiv, in 2 universities, they have Crimean state level, Crimean Tatar language courses. And this is another way for decolonization. The Ukrainians themselves, they started to learn Crimean Tatar language, not because they need it, but because they are interested to know who we are. And as a Crimean Tatar, I really like it. When it comes to how do we engage and how do we promote this language? How do we get it? How do we introduce it in our language? As an artist, I design clothing, and I have a separate line where all names are Crimean and Tatar words. For example, everyone knows a shirt. I call it kolmek, and this is my way of cultural diplomacy, and everyone who knows my art, my products, they learn that language in that way. If I want to communicate with my compatriots in Romania, in Turkey, and I really like Romania, I don't know Romanian language, they don't know Ukrainian or Russian, the only language in common is Tatar. And when you are there, they are really happy that they have this opportunity to use Crimean Tatar language, because that's unique. And it gives you an impetus to polish your knowledge, because my language is quite related to daily things, and I want to use a political vocabulary, other types of vocabulary to be able to express myself. I really want have a lot of ideas, but I know we are limited in time. Thank you. Denis Pilash, Common Journal.
All your contributions, and it has to be said that it's quite seductive to adhere to a sort of campus thinking when geopolitical is the enemy or my enemy is my friend, and thus Ukrainians often feel how people in other regions lack knowledge about the context of Eastern Europe, Central Europe, the history of Russian imperialism. This gives Russian propaganda the space to play as if Russia is sort of a counterweight to Western imperialists and not just another white colonizers' empire that also was like living beside genocide, assimilation, and all other imperial stuff. But also, for instance, here in Ukraine, you will also find people who would diminish or deny the atrocities that have been done by the Western imperialists, like the English, Americans, Germans, French, and so on. Even today we spoke how we still lack awareness about the indigenous history of Crimea and the Crimean Tatar people. So what are your suggestions how to become this real, consistent anti-colonialists that oppose any sort of colonialism and neocolonialism, no matter from what part of the world it comes?
Thank you very much for the question. I suggest everyone could answer, but briefly.
Well, again, I mean, the decolonial activity is really not, it's not an action, it's more of a process. So it really includes in it a lot of different aspects, as you have mentioned, and some of the others have mentioned. It's reimagining, it's actually reframing and rewriting, in a good sense, reassessing the history from the point of view of a colonized nation. So basically having the ability to go back to things that have happened, reevaluate them for you, for us, for example, for our history in Central Asia. For you, that would be Ukrainian history. For the Crimean Tatars, that would be Crimean Tatar history, and so on. So that is a really large part of that. And just continue voicing that narrative, and continue sharing your views, the information in every possible way, in social media, in newspapers and articles and interviews. So basically, I think it's very important to be able to use any available platform to put forward that information. It's very important. You might think it's not important. It is really important. You might think people know about it because you've talked about it 1,000 times. Somebody else talked about it 1,000,000 times. No. It's like, you know, there are some very simple truths that people repeat on a daily basis and they still don't stick. You know, so it's really important to just keep repeating it until it's there, and then until most of the people that you need to hear do hear that. So the other aspect to decolonial activity would be ensuring that the people who are trying to preserve the colonial narratives, to ensure that they receive adequate response. So meaning, for example, the various Russian journalists that are functioning now also in exile, unfortunately continue to perpetuate the Kremlin propaganda, thinking that it's very important for them to actually preserve, you know, this image of Russia, and to somehow convince the West, convince Europe in particular, that somehow Russia, for example, is is a part of European civilization. I think that was the last time that I've read Yulia Navalny's speech, for example, and it's not. You know, I think it's very important to be able to challenge these narratives and to come forward with an actual opposite opinion. If that is your opinion, just tell these people who are trying to save and preserve and continue these the imperial narratives that it's not true. Russia is not a part of European civilization, because when you become a part of European civilization, it's not only a geographical matter. You also have to bring your values with it, to it, and so that is a very important aspect of that as well. I think also rethinking your traditions and what you are willing to bring with you into the future is also a very big part of decolonial discourse. So whatever from the past can be carried forward for the next generations. So what is important to impart in the coming generations, I think that is also quite important. So it's very multifaceted field that you can apply it anywhere, really, in academic work, in art, in filmmaking. I don't know, it's anything. You can do anything with it, really.
Thank you. Anyone would like to add something? Yeah. How about the time? Okay, so...
Okay. So, then I can have my question. Thank you all for your perfect speeches you were giving here, but also I'm myself a lawyer, and I am very interested in reconciliation policies and how to integrate the decolonization process into reconciliation and the healing of the society after the conflict. Because in Ukraine we have different histories, we have different levels of histories, like macro history, mini history. So it's basically a lot of voices that should be voiced. But also there is a process when you need to follow the truth-telling instruments, you need to follow all this truth-telling mechanism to reconcile the society, to make these healings for it, and especially into when, like, for example, all these occupied regions will be deoccupied tomorrow. There will be more than 1 million of people with different thinking, with different mindset, and how to create the process of decolonization, but also of reconciliation of society, to not evolve into a new conflict, into polarization of societies, because we have different histories in south, in west, in north of Ukraine, and also to incorporate all our history into international history, so we do not conflict with our international partners like Poland or Lithuania or even Russia aftermath, because we still need to communicate with them in any case. Thank you.
Thank you.
This reminds me of a question that you posed when we were preparing for this panel about if it's possible to decolonize the culture without canceling, and is it possible to the liberalization without anger? And I reflected on that, and I think that at least in the first part, anger is important, rageous anger, and then, yes, reconciliation. But you need first to do this process of anger, because anger is often the first signal of a lie that has been finally named and recognized. But anger, yes, is not and should not be the destination. Decolonization requires moving from anger to rethinking and redefining beauty, and then to creation. I think anger opens the door, and then creation builds the house. So I think, yes, definitely reconciliation should be a destiny, but we have to go through the painful process of recognizing that harm has been done.
Thank you very much. Maybe if Clinifa is still with us, you could add also on the experience of South Africa and Truth and Reconciliation Committee.
Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity, and I'm so grateful that I was on this panel. I think, so for many people, they think that reconciliation is a once-off process, but actually the experience of South Africa is showing that reconciliation is never done. The whole idea is that when you are thinking about reconciling with your former colonizer, you are not thinking about giving them a free pass, because this is how, in the past, people categorized the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that people were given a free pass. And that was not really the truth and the way in which the commission was conceived. You are giving people the opportunity to take responsibility. I mean, this is the way in which I would define the idea of reconciliation, is you are giving people the opportunity to take responsibility for the crimes that they've committed against other people. And the other point that I also want to make is that colonialism in one place is colonialism everywhere. The colonial mindset is an infectious disease and can affect anybody. So in some ways, we all have an interest. Those of us who've been oppressed have an interest in solidarity, so that we are not always fighting these fights alone. And so when we think about, again, reconciliation, South Africa created a particular kind of model of reconciliation, but it shouldn't be the only one. As I say, this conversation should be going on amongst all peoples who have been formerly oppressed and colonized. And it should not be thought of as a once-off, that, oh, we've done reconciliation, now let's get on with life. It's really a continuous process of re-evaluating harm, re-evaluating injustice, and then re-evaluating the concept of repair. How do you undo the history of colonialism? How do you undo the wounds and the suffering and the pain that people have suffered under the colonial regime? So that's what I would like to add as a final comment, that whatever you think about reconciliation, it is not a once-off, and it's not something that only has to happen once. It can happen many, many times as these questions of injustice keep arising.
Thank you very much. I guess, all right. The last question, yeah? Last question for today.
Okay, I have just one remark. Talking about decolonization of Crimea, we have one missing elephant in this room, and this is Ukraine. Because if Crimea is a part of Ukraine, and Ukraine, as much as the Crimea proper was the object of colonization, we have to think about decolonization of Ukraine as well, and decolonization of Crimea as a part of Ukraine. And in this case, we should not limit ourselves to treating relations between Russia and Crimea. We have to bring to the fore relations between Ukraine and its part, Crimea. And we have a lot to do with this process of decolonization. And this is just one remark. Another remark, I would praise you for bringing to the fore this question about aesthetics. And as a small example about aesthetics of decolonization and usefulness of thinking about Crimea as a part of Ukraine and thinking about interaction, aesthetic interaction between Ukraine and Crimea, I would bring just few examples of borrowings from the Crimean Tatar culture into Ukrainian culture. And I will start with the word which Ukrainians use for trousers, which is element of fashion, and they use the Crimean Tatar word, the Turkish word, whereas Turks themselves, and this is shtani, of course, which means underwear, actually. Whereas Turks use the word borrowed from French. Another word, extremely important for Ukraine, the first name of Ukrainian nation is the Cossack nation. But the Cossack, the word itself was appropriated, borrowed, loaned from the Turkish languages, and it was first written in the dictionary of Turkic dialect spoken in the Crimean and in the Mongol Khanate by Italians, and this book is preserved in Venice. So you may trust me. So the Cossack means predator, by the way, not a very pleasing, characteristic, but it was incorporated, and by this name, Ukrainians are even officially known for 400 years. And finally, the final word, meydan, is another Turkish loan word which was combined by Ukrainians with the word euro and expressed aspirations of Ukrainians for their future. That's it.
Thank you very much. Yes.
I'll just, if I can, I do agree with Professor in many ways, especially in terms of bringing, for sure, Ukraine into the equation when looking at the Crimean Tatar situation. And I can actually even bring up a very similar situation that we have in Central Asia about colonialism, and another layer to it also, and that is the situation, you probably know about it, in Uzbekistan. We have a sovereign republic of Karakalpakstan inside Uzbekistan that is kind of similar in the situation. The problem, however, is it's not only Uzbekistan that has not reconciled, and Uzbeks have not reconciled, just like us, anything with the Russians or Russian imperialism or colonialism, so that discussion didn't even start. But they also started applying much the same methods towards the Karakalpaks that they control, to the point where Karakalpaks right now are not allowed to use Karakalpak language in public spaces in their own republic. So we have a lot of very similar situations from which I think Ukraine and Crimean Tatar diaspora can probably learn a lot, and also see, good examples and also see the bad examples. In terms of reconciliation, I do agree with the previous speaker as well. It's not a one-time thingy. It's not like you can do it once, and it's a very long process as well. And unfortunately, as I have mentioned, the reconciliation with our colonial past with Russia that discussion has not even started. They did not acknowledge. They do not acknowledge. They do not understand. They do not want to talk about it. They are very nervous even about us raising the issue. And so I know for sure that the scholars that are researching the issue of decolonization in Kyrgyzstan, I don't really go into deep research on that. It's like I kind of it's a part of my job, but not as deep. But there are some other colleagues that actually dig very deep, and they do experience a lot of problems with the Russian FSB in Kyrgyzstan, who surveil them, who control them through digital means and so on. So there are issues. They really don't like it. So yeah, it's. I think that process is gonna take a while before anybody will be able to say that the reconciliation process has begun or is at some level where people are able to speak. But again, yes, it's not like you reconcile and you let the colonizer a free pass. It's not. It shouldn't be like that for sure.
Thank you very much. Thank you all the guests. Thank you, amazing audience and the team of Crimea Global. On this, we finish the conversation about the colonialism, which is completely not over, and I hope all of us will find our own ways. How do we treat this experience and have an amazing last panel ahead of you.
Друзі, дякуємо всім.
Thank you, everyone, dear friends. Let's reassemble here in 15 minutes.